Je m'appelle Christina, j'ai 15 ans et je viens de Roumanie. J'habitais et après j'ai parti en Angleterre. J'étais avec mes petites sœurs et mes petits frères. Je les regardais, j'étais avec tout le temps dans la maison. Et puis, et après un jour, ma mère m'a mariée. Un copain à elle, ils sont venus chez nous et il a dit pour qui je veux me marier et ça. Et moi, comme j'ai écouté ça, je pleurais, j'ai fait plein de trucs pour que je me marie pas avec lui. Il fait, ça c'est la décision que moi je l'ai prise et toi tu veux le faire. Mon mari, il avait 18 ans et j'avais que 13 ans et je savais rien faire. Il était méchant. Il ne savait même pas comment il se comporte avec une fille ou avec une fille de 15 ans ou de 14 ans. Il se comportait comme une femme qui a 20 ans ou 30 ans, je ne sais pas combien. Après, j'ai parti en Roumanie. Ils ont fait mes passeports, mes trucs. Et après, j'ai allé en Espagne. Moi, je voulais, lui, il restait à la maison. Et jamais je voulais. Mais j'étais obligée parce que si je ne le faisais pas, il me frappait. Après, dans l'Espagne, parce qu'ils se regardaient, parce qu'on ne peut pas voler, et ça, j'ai parti avec lui ici en Belgique. Je pense parce que c'était pas bien que je fais ça, je voulais pour que j'arrête ça. Et jusqu'au moment pour la police m'a arrêté. C'est moi que j'ai laissé pour qu'il me prenne exprès. Parce que si je n'avais pas laissé ça, jamais j'étais là. Il m'a mis dans un centre et là-bas j'ai commencé à vivre normal. Et j'ai réfléchi encore qu'est-ce qui s'est passé ça, j'ai trop mal au cœur.
This is the story of Christina, one of hundreds of thousands of stories, one of possibly millions of stories of girls and boys across the world. As I speak to you here today, children worldwide fall victims to unscrupulous traffickers who exploit their bodies and who exploit their souls. For sexual exploitation of all deplorable forms, from child prostitution and pornography to sex tourism, for child labor, for organ removal, for forced child marriages, for begging, for child selling. Deprived from their childhood, even if saved, and if not re-trafficked, these children are scarred for life. This sounds inconceivable, but it is the reality we live in. Child trafficking is closer to our societies than we might think. And it is especially now, in these difficult times of global socioeconomic turbulence, that traffickers target the most vulnerable of our societies, our children. It is precisely for this reason that this global online conference to counter child trafficking is taking place today, and I warmly want to thank the organizers for such an interesting and timely initiative. Our methods and our means may differ, but I think we're all joined today by the same concerns and the same values. We are joined by the same basic objective. It is simple, that of ensuring that our children are safe and that they are protected from criminals who deprive them of their most basic of human rights. We at the European Union are uniquely positioned to address child trafficking. We have legislation that is binding on member states. We have robust enforcement mechanisms to make sure that each and every member state complies with this legislation. Further, we have a dynamic and forward-looking policy framework, and we have available funding for realizing our policy priorities. I am proud to say that the EU has come a long way to this uphill struggle of addressing child trafficking. But I also have to say that we still have a great deal to do. I am convinced that it is only by working together that we can eradicate the slavery of our times. It is at least our moral duty to ensure that all relevant actors work in synergy for addressing comprehensively the needs of victims, and at the same time for making sure that children are not victimized in the first place. I will proceed to present to you the very ambitious and indeed very comprehensive EU legal framework and its child-sensitive spirit. I will further elaborate on the EU policy framework, which follows a child protection system approach. I will present to you some statistical data on child trafficking, and then I'll finish with concrete suggestions for future consideration. I speak to you here today in my capacity as the EU Anti-Trafficking Coordinator, mandated by the European Commission. The post I currently hold is enshrined in the EU legislation, and it precisely indicates the willingness of EU member states to address trafficking in human beings. I am mandated in this context to improve coordination and coherence amongst EU institutions, EU agencies, member states, international actors, and to provide overall strategic policy orientation in this respect. Let me come to what we know about the phenomenon of trafficking in human beings. Measuring the extent of this crime is a daunting task. According to the first statistical data report at the EU level, 15% of the total number of identified or suspected victims of trafficking in the EU are children. That is 12% girls and 3% boys. Data prove that the most widespread form of exploitation is sexual exploitation, that is around 62%, with women and girls as the overwhelming majority of the victims, that is 96% in 2010. There has been a gradual increase in the number of male victims across the 3 years. Trafficking for labor exploitation constitutes 25% of the reported cases, the vast majority of its victims being men and boys in this instance, 77%, followed by other forms, such as for the removal of organs, criminal activities, for selling of children. Further, EU data shows that internal trafficking is on the rise. This means that child trafficking is not always about migration, and it is not always about crossing international borders. We are aware that this is the tip of the iceberg. We must continue our joint efforts to improve the type and the quality of the data collected so as to better inform our policies and ultimately help the victims. As I explained before, the EU law and policies follow an integrated, a comprehensive approach, and they place children at their heart. Let me elaborate on this. For the first time, the legislation at the EU level, adopted in 2011, focuses not only on law enforcement, but also on prevention, on protection, on building partnerships in addressing trafficking in human beings. This EU legislation, the EU Directive, recognizes the gendered nature of trafficking, and especially on child victims. It's characterized by innovative provisions that set forth a robust protective and preventive framework. In the EU anti-trafficking legislation, all children are considered vulnerable, regardless of their status. Assistance, support, protection must be provided to them on an unconditional basis. This means that children should get immediate access to assistance and protection without any other requirements, such as cooperating with the authorities or initiating criminal proceedings. More specifically, our directive, our legislation, states very clearly and from the outset that the child's best interest must be of primary consideration. That is in accordance with our Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union and the 1989 United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It goes further to stress that when a child is considered, no possible consent should ever be considered valid. The directive is also very clear. Children should never be punished for their involvement in criminal activities completed to commit as a direct consequence of being trafficked. In other words, children should under no circumstances end up behind bars. This is where traffickers belong. Additionally, the directive establishes extraterritorial jurisdiction. What that means is that member states can prosecute their nationals for crimes committed outside their territory. This is an important tool for tackling child sex tourism, for example. When it comes to specifically to assistance and support to child victims, the legislation dedicates a specific section. EU law creates obligations for member states that where it is difficult to establish the age of the child, where there is uncertainty of age, to presume childhood in order to give immediate access to assistance, support, and protection. So disputed age should never be to the detriment of victims. I repeat that these are beneficial measures, and they must be granted unconditionally and to all children. They can be short and long-term, related to their physical, their psychosocial recovery, and undertaken following an individual assessment of the special circumstances of each and every particular child victim. The child's views, needs, concerns must be taken into account in order to find a durable solution for the child. And here I would like to stress the importance of enshrining the child participation principle in our legislation. That very much reflects the principle enshrined in Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I continue with this innovative EU legislation. It provides for access to education and for appointment of guardians or legal representatives for ensuring the child's best interest and or from representing the child. I would say, in a revolutionary way, the directive further provides possibility for member states to provide assistance and support to the family of a child victim of trafficking in human beings. Specifically, for the protection of child victims in criminal investigations and proceedings, the EU member states are obliged to ensure that child victims have access without delay to free legal counseling and to free legal representation. Additionally, necessary measures should be taken to ensure that secondary victimization is avoided by using new technologies. Especially for unaccompanied child victims, the legislation obliges the EU member states for taking necessary measures for finding a durable solution based on an individual assessment. Member states of the EU were obliged to adopt national law translating this EU legislation into their national jurisdictions. Up to this day, only 16 EU member states have informed us for having done so. There is absolutely no time to waste when human lives are at stake. I sincerely believe that if meaningfully implemented in partnership with the civil society, the EU law can make a difference in victims' lives, in children's lives. The comprehensive and ambitious legislation is there at the EU level. What we have to do now is focus on full implementation of all the measures, and we must support them with an appropriate policy framework. For this reason, the European Commission in 2012 adopted a new and integrated policy framework guiding our work until 2016. So the EU strategy towards the eradication of trafficking in human beings, it's our 5-year strategic policy plan, and it brings the good forces of the EU together. It is basically structured around 5 priority areas. So the first thing is the identification, protection, and assistance of victims. The second is the prevention of human trafficking, and of course that includes the reduction of demand. The third one is the increased prosecution of traffickers. There is, of course, the need for enhanced coordination and cooperation and policy coherence. And finally, we need to know more. We need increased knowledge and better response. So we have 40 concrete, quite ambitious, and time-bound actions that engage policymakers from various fields and our EU member states. This policy framework has been very highly welcome by a variety of stakeholders: government officials, frontline officials, civil society organizations, and more. I am sure that we are on the right path. I will highlight some of the actions that relate to children more directly, but please do look at all the work that is available online in our dedicated website and where you can find all this information. So the EU strategy recognizes that all relevant actors are involved in addressing trafficking in human beings, from civil society organizations to healthcare and labor inspectors, border guards, child care and protection authorities, a very long list. So comprehensive child-sensitive protection systems that ensure interagency and multidisciplinary coordination are key to cater to diverse needs of diverse groups of children, including victims of trafficking. So for this reason, in 2013, the European Commission will fund the development of guidelines on child protection systems. In this manner, I am sure we can contribute and assist member states in catering for the needs of child victims while addressing trafficking in human beings, amongst others. Last year as well, as for this year too, the EU Forum on the Rights of the Child is focusing on developing these child protection systems. We receive input to our work on developing the guidelines by a very broad variety of stakeholders, which welcomed the idea of developing, of course, these guidelines. And in addition, in 2014, and together with our European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the European Commission will present a best practice model on the role of guardians and representatives of child victims of trafficking. This will provide further guidance on examples that can be followed for improving systems in place or indeed addressing their absence. We really hope that this will be useful and a practical tool for practitioners in this field, and it will contribute to creating more coherence at the EU level. We further need to increase awareness of the rights of all victims to all frontline officials, to the NGOs, and more importantly, to the victims themselves. Because of the European Union's legal and policy framework and focus on victims, and children in particular, we have recently published the EU Rights of Victims of Trafficking in Human Beings. This is one of the deliverables of the strategy. For example, was the publication of this handbook that provides clear and accessible overview that is user-friendly information for victims, practitioners, and member states. It's an overview of EU rights of victims of trafficking in human beings based on EU law. And this is now available in all the 23 languages online. You will find the link at the end of my presentation. So it has been designed to provide practitioners with a picture as complete as possible on the specific rights in the different areas relating to trafficking in human beings, based on common sense. So we have an exhaustive list of victims, social, labor, migrant rights, as well as the rights on international protection. Cooperation with the private sector is also essential in order to reduce the demand for trafficking in human beings. A European Business Coalition Against Trafficking will be established in 2014, so next year, according again to the EU strategy, to the policy framework. This coalition should improve cooperation with businesses and other stakeholders responsible to respond to emerging challenges and discuss measures to prevent trafficking in human beings, in particular in high-risk areas. But I think one cannot talk about trafficking in children, indeed trafficking in human beings, without addressing the issue of prevention and without addressing demand that fosters all forms of exploitation. We all know that there is no supply without demand. And for children to be trafficked, there are people out there who, one way or another, use the services of these children. For each child that is sexually exploited, there is someone out there who exploits that child. We must protect that child. And we must ensure that the users, the buyers, the exploiters end up behind bars. Without them, there's no trafficking. This is why the EU approach places focus on prevention measures, including the measures to curb demand. We must therefore strengthen child protection systems before children fall victims of traffickers. We must invest in learning more about the vulnerability factors and how we work together to fight poverty, social exclusion, discrimination. And this is exactly what we have embarked on at the EU level. The trends are alarming. The numbers of identified and presumed victims increased by 18% between 2008 and 2010. But the overall number of convictions decreased by 17%. Demand for trafficking is on the rise, as Europol informs us, especially in times of economic crisis. It is important to highlight also the importance of gender in this context. Our EU legislation and policy are very clear in the interplay between gender and trafficking human beings. We must place a lot of attention to the different needs of girls and boys, and we must attempt to tackle the whole cycle of trafficking in a gender-specific manner. It is clear that for implementing some of the actions, funding is required, and financial support is always sought. I'm very proud to say that the European Commission is one of the world's major donors, and that substantial funding has been allocated for addressing trafficking. I am currently in the process of mapping the funding dispersed on anti-trafficking projects in order to ensure coherence with the EU policy. Once such a challenging task is complete, it can contribute to our efforts to have better informed policy. And indeed, ensure that we broaden our reach out to stakeholders who can contribute in the work that we do against trafficking. The need and effort to diversify funding and the recipient is evident. We have, in the last 2 years, reached out more widely to member states, to civil society organizations, and we have involved more and new stakeholders. In our last dedicated funding call, we received 4 times more applications than before. It is encouraging, of course, but our work is far from done. And I intend to insist in this direction and ensure even wider knowledge and active engagement of diverse stakeholders at the EU level, and proper use of our funding possibilities. You can find an extensive overview of all these projects at the EU Anti-Trafficking website. We are working to ensure, to the extent possible, that every single project that we ever funded is eventually on this website. We need to ask ourselves hard questions on the impact of our existing legislative and policy measures, on our programming, on our funding, on our actions, on our initiatives. Have we done enough? Has it been effective? Should we do things differently? This is the spirit of the EU Directive and the EU strategy. As a next step, and reflecting the need for greater coherence in policies across sectors that affect anti-trafficking work and initiatives, we will conduct a comprehensive review of these projects to map the geographical areas, fields, different actors, types of projects, as well as the outcomes and recommendations. This review, we hope, will strengthen future projects and provide a solid basis for coherent, cost-effective, strategic EU policy and funding initiatives. One of the actors systematically referred to in EU law and policy is the civil society organizations. I will tirelessly call for engaging systematically and consistently with civil society and consider them equal partners in our efforts. The Commission, acknowledging this, launched in May 2013 the EU Civil Society Platform Against Trafficking in Human Beings. This platform brings together more than 100 NGOs and creates a space for interaction. We have a second meeting coming up at the beginning of December. And we intend to work closely with the civil society in our efforts to address child trafficking. You can find all this information on the EU Anti-Trafficking website. As I said before, you can find the link at the end of my presentation. And talking of the internet, we are fully aware that it plays a key role in trafficking. Be it either for prevention or for recruitment, internet is at the forefront of any action relating to addressing trafficking human beings. And for this reason, the focus of the 7th EU Anti-Trafficking Day on the 18th of October, in cooperation with the Lithuanian presidency of the EU, is precisely the links between trafficking and online recruitment, or indeed online awareness raising. So to go back to the website, we have created this EU Anti-Trafficking website. It's a portal with all information on EU developments, on laws, on policies, on funding opportunities, national information and civil society information. We are very happy that we managed to update this website very regularly, and we are happy to note that it's very well visited. As I mentioned earlier, you can find the link at the end. Colleagues, ladies, gentlemen, everyone participating at the online event. My message is simple and it is clear. And it is one that I have repeated many times in the last 2 years. We cannot afford to waste any time. We must act now, and we must act together. The legal and the policy framework is strong. It's enabling. And we must focus our future actions on their implementation. We are now in the process of assessing how our EU member states comply with their legal implications under EU law. I said this in the beginning of my presentation, and I'll say it again. I sincerely believe that if meaningfully applied, this EU legislation will make a difference and indeed save the lives of many victims. We have really come a long way, and we have a lot of work ahead. We are ambitious, and we must continue in this way. And I think it is the least we can do for children who have been irretrievably deprived of their childhood. And it is the least we can do to prevent more from falling victims of such a heinous crime. I want to first thank you for listening. I wish you a very meaningful conference that will bring together the good forces around the world to work on a very clear and a very common goal.